Plywood is one of the best things to happen in woodworking since the invention of the table saw. It's used in everything from building cabinets to furniture and even shop jigs. But it also brings with it loads of challenges that have ruined many woodworking projects. So today I'm going to show you how to handle the biggest issues we all face when dealing with plywood, as well as some tips on finding the right plywood for your project. And by the end of this video, you'll be building more professional looking projects while saving hundreds of dollars and avoiding tons of frustration. One of the most frustrating problems when it comes to plywood is getting really bad tear out. Now, tear out happens when the wood fibers on the surface splinter as you're cutting the wood, and they stand up, and this looks just really awful, especially on plywood whenever the second layer of veneer can be seen. Now, the best way of dealing with tear out is to completely avoid it to begin with, and there's a few simple tricks that you can use to do just that. Now, one method I've seen people use a lot is to use regular blue painter's tape over the cut line. Now, the tape supports the wood fibers as you're making the cut, making them much less likely to splinter. Now, while this does work, I'm not really a big fan of this method, mainly because it just takes too much time and effort to carefully lay out all of your cut lines with the tape. That's just an extra step that takes up my already very limited shop time, and that's if I can actually remember to put the tape on before every cut, which honestly, it's probably never going to happen.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
So instead, I like to keep things simple and a bit more dummy proof. And one easy way to do this is by using the right blade. See, plywood cuts best with a high tooth count blade that slices through the wood fibers instead of chewing through the wood like a ripping blade would, or even a combination blade. Now, while the right blade certainly helps, it's not completely foolproof. There's a couple of other things that you can do that will help to completely eliminate tear out. Now, the first thing you should do is make sure you're using the cutting direction of your blade in your favor. Now, on a circular saw or a track saw, this means cutting with the good face of the material facing down so that the blade is cutting into the wood. Now, on the table saw, the blade is cutting downward, so make sure that your good face is facing up to avoid tear out. So that's great if you're only worried about tear out on one side of the board, but what if you want to avoid tear out on both sides? Well, in order to do that, you'll need to provide some support on the wood fibers on the exit side of the blade as well. Now, this is where something like a track saw or the DIY equivalent comes in. These can provide support for the wood fibers to prevent tear out, but only on the one side where the track is. Now, at the table saw, you'll need a zero clearance insert. That's going to provide the support for the wood fibers on both sides of the cut, preventing tear out completely. Now, another tool that produces a lot of tear out is the router. And it doesn't matter if you're using a handheld router or the router table. You see, straight bits or spiral upcut bits are both going to pull at and tear the fibers out, leaving a very jagged cut. However, if you use a spiral downcut bit, that is actually pushing the wood fibers back down into the plywood, which is going to give you a much cleaner and tear out free result. Now, the faces of good quality plywood can look absolutely amazing, especially when you start getting into some higher quality hardwood veneers. Now, the edges, on the other hand, well, that's another story. You could be dealing with lots of voids and even some odd colored layers because that's typically where they're going to use some cheaper substandard materials. But unless you're going to be making your own plywood with those fancy geometric shapes, we need to find a way to cover up and hide those ugly edges. So let's look at three methods that I use, from the fast and easy to one that's a lot more durable. And then if you're planning on painting your plywood, well, I've got a trick for you that I bet you've never seen that's going to make that so much easier. Now, one of the fastest and easiest ways of dealing with those ugly plywood edges is with actual edge banding. This typically comes in rolls and has glue already on the back of it. It goes on really quickly with just a little bit of heat from a clothes iron. Afterwards, you just trim the edges with a specialty trimmer or just use a few swipes with a block plane. Now, this is a quick and simple method for covering up those edges and is similar to how most industrial shops do it, although they typically have some heavy equipment that does this pretty quickly and takes out all the manual work. Now, another method that I like to use, and quite honestly, it's my favorite, is to use solid wood edge banding. And you can see a couple of examples of that here on this outfeed table. Now, not only does this solid wood edge banding look much better, especially over just the plain plywood or melamine edges, it also adds a lot of strength and protects the edges from any type of damage. It can also make your drawers much stronger with that solid wood and not just the sheet goods. To make this solid wood edging, you just need to cut some thin strips of hardwood. In this case, I've got some cherry, and then you just glue this onto the edge of the plywood. And once the glue is dried, you can use a router with a bearing guided bit or just a hand plane and flush up those edges. Okay, but what if you just want to paint your project? You probably don't want to go through all the effort of applying edge banding, even if it's just the iron-on type. The problem with not doing anything to the edges at all is even after multiple coats of paint, the end grain is going to keep soaking up that paint and leave the various plies visible on the edges. Now this can be really frustrating and make your projects look cheap and really amateur. But I found a really quick and easy way to deal with this. Before you start painting, just spread some glue on the edges. Now this is going to fill in all those tiny voids and all the wood pores, and it's going to prevent the wood from soaking up all of that paint. Now on these test pieces, you can clearly see even after multiple coats, the paint is still being absorbed into the end grain of this plywood. But the one where we applied the glue to the edge before we painted it, it looks great. We've got a nice even coating of paint after just a single coat. This is going to save you a lot of time and paint, and it's going to make your projects look a whole lot better. Now, the majority of the time when you're working with plywood, whether you're building cabinets, jigs, or furniture, you're probably going to be using some screws to hold your parts together. And because of the intersecting layers of the veneers, plywood has excellent screw holding power as long as you're driving the screws through the faces. However, these glued up layers also make plywood very weak whenever you drive a screw in through an edge. The screw can act like a wedge and separate the layers, causing the plywood to split. A simple way to avoid this is to drill a pilot hole for the screw. This gives room for the screw shaft so that it doesn't spread the plywood layers apart. Now you can just use a regular drill bit to drill this pilot hole. The drill bit should be about the same size as the shaft of the screw. Just make sure that it's smaller than the threads so that the threads can still bite into the wood. But I prefer to use a bit that drills the pilot hole and a countersink for the screw head at the same time. And you can get some really inexpensive sets like this that work just great. But if you spend a little bit more, you can get something like this Amana tool that has a built-in depth stop for perfectly sized countersinks every time. Now once you have your pilot holes for the screws, don't forget to use some wood glue in the joint before you drive in the screws. Because plywood still has this weak holding power in this direction, you really can't rely on just the screws alone to hold your projects together. Now if you're looking for an even stronger joint without screws, it's hard to beat a dado. Now dados are a great option for adding shelves to cabinets and bookcases. A dado is simply a groove cut into a piece that's perfectly sized to hold an adjoining piece of wood at 90 degrees. Add a little bit of glue to the joint and you don't even need screws. The problem is getting accurately sized dados that have a good tight fit instead of a loose, sloppy joint. Now, most people think of the table saw and a dado stack whenever they think about cutting this joint. The problem is you just can't set up a 3/4 inch dado stack if you want a well-fitting joint for 3/4 inch plywood. And this is because 3/4 inch plywood isn't really 3/4 of an inch thick. It's actually slightly under. So if you go with the nominal thickness on the dado stack, you're going to end up with a very loose joint. Now you could use the shims that come with the dado stack and go through some trial and error with a bunch of test cuts and zero in on that perfect fit, but it's really going to take a lot more time and effort and, quite frankly, patience than I can afford. There's got to be a better way, right? Well, let me introduce you to my little friend, the Plywood dado router bit.
This is the way.
Now, these router bits are undersized, just like the plywood is, so you get a perfectly fitting dado without all the hassle. Now, I really like to use these spiral downcut router bits that I got from Bits and Bits. These downward spirals push the wood fibers down, preventing tear out, just like we talked about with the saw blades earlier. The spiral cutting action also makes it slice through the wood a lot easier and produces less heat, so they don't burn the wood like you might get with a straight bit. And if you'd like to check these out, I've got a link down in the video description. Click on that to go take a look at these. Also, make sure you use my discount code for an extra 10% off. Now, like most of you, I'm usually working alone in my shop, and while I enjoy the peace and quiet that comes with working alone, it does come at a cost. I don't know about you all, but I have a really hard time maneuvering full sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. A full sheet can weigh about 75 pounds, and MDF is even worse at nearly 100 pounds a sheet. Now, that might not seem like a lot to some of you guys, but it can be very difficult to manage without having an easy grip or a helping hand. Plus, at my age, it's starting to take a while to recover if I do throw my back out of whack. So I use a panel carrier called a Gorilla Gripper to help me move around full sheets of plywood. And instead of trying to wrestle the plywood up on top of my workbench or a table saw, I like to lay it down on some foam board on the floor. Then I can use my track saw and break down the full sheets into more manageable pieces that I can then bring to the table saw. Now, this saves my back and ensures that I can be out in the shop again tomorrow to continue to work. Not only does choosing the right tools and equipment have a big impact on your project, but choosing the right sheet of plywood is going to have a massive impact on how the project turns out. And not every sheet of plywood is just like any other, even out of the same stack. For example, you should never buy the top or the bottom sheet off a stack of plywood. For one, the top sheet is likely to have been exposed to the sun and rain during transport. This makes it much more likely to bow and warp. Also, the bands that they use to hold the whole stack together as they're shipping it on the pallets, these tend to dig into that top and bottom sheet. So unless you want those marks in your project, just leave those for somebody else that's boarding up some windows. Now, hardwood plywood is denser and stronger, also more stable and better suited for furniture and cabinetry, while plywood made of softwoods like pine and fir, these are better suited for construction like framing and subflooring. You can also tell the difference between the quality of plywood by the number of plies it has. Now, there are some exceptions to this, like MDF and combi-core plywood, but in general, the more layers that there are in the plywood, the more strength and stability the plywood's going to have. For example, if you took a sheet of birch from Home Depot, you'll see it has about 5 to 7 internal layers. Now, this is not the same Baltic birch that you hear about people talking about so often. If you look at true Baltic birch, it has about 13 internal layers and looks vastly different from what you see at Home Depot and Lowe's. And when it comes to building with plywood, cabinets and furniture aren't the only options. Some of my favorite things to build out of plywood are some really useful jigs that make woodworking faster, easier, and even safer. So be sure to check out this video over here where I show you how to build 7 of my favorite shop jigs that replace even expensive equipment in the shop.